Huge difference, right? So fisheye, anything below really 16 millimeters, has an incredibly actiony, energetic effect because, like I said, it's distorting the light that's going into the image, that's going into the sensor of the camera. So when you're warping this light, and the light that's going into the camera is just simply the energy of the moment, the more you're warping it, the more of that actiony aesthetic that you're creating. So if I move through the actual space, you can see that it has this kind of different aesthetic than a normal medium lens or a telephoto lens doesn't have. This is very opens up the space. You can see when I move through space, it warps it and kind of almost exaggerates that feeling and creates more excitement with movement. So like I said, this is excellent with action, sports, anything where there's a lot of movement and you want to capture it and you want the viewer to really feel like they're actually a part of that space. You don't want to sit back with the telephoto lens and be all the way zoomed in because you're going to flatten everything. You want to get close to the subject and get a very wide angle lens. Now, one thing with that is it's not a very, how do I say this? Aesthetically, it's not a beauty lens, right? So the closer you get to it, the more distorted faces will get. So if you're shooting something for beauty and more of that naturalistic feel, you're not going to want to use a super wide fisheye because you're going to get a much more of a warping effect. But when you know that consciously, you can use that to enhance the action and the energy that's already happening in front of the camera. And with that said, I used fisheye lenses all the time back in my skateboarding days because it just captures the energy. You're allowed or you're able to get close to the subject and still grab all of the texture and all of the feeling. All right, now we're at 22 millimeters. A pretty big difference from where we were at before. This is more of that wide angle range in between the 20s and 30s, which I really enjoy. It doesn't have as much, distortion of movement and not as much energy as the fisheye feeling, but you're still able to capture the viewer and make them feel like they're in the room and they're in the space because of the amount of width that they can see. But on the other hand, it does kind of narrow things down to give a little bit more of a professional feel because we're narrowing down what the viewer is seeing and having more of a focus on a subject. So I think this is an excellent, excellent focal range in the 20 to 30s to use for people like YouTubers because it kind of has that kind of energetic feeling. It's not super professional and flattened out, and you still feel like you're in the room, so it's easier for the viewer to connect with the subject. And so now we're at 50 millimeters. You can see that it's a huge, huge difference with just a little change in the focal length of the lens. You can see it's a much more professional feeling, which is good for certain scenarios depending on what you're shooting. But you can also see that it's cut out a lot on the depth of feeling the kind of space that I'm in. But on the other side, it really, really cuts me out from the backdrop, right? So this is really, really good for creating that super shallow depth of field look when you really want to create that blurred out background. For this course in particular, I didn't want to go with the 50 millimeter because I knew that it would get a little bit bland. But as far as using it in your films, 50 millimeter is an incredibly great focal range, focal length to use because of its professional look. So now we're at 70 millimeters. You can see a huge difference between the 50 to the 70. We're narrowing down the audience's field of view even more and saying what's in this frame is so important that it's filling the entire field of view for the viewer. So you can use this as a tool to really hammer home a point in your film where what the subject is saying is so important, right? Because they're saying something that is so important for the film that they need to cover the entire frame. Just kidding, but you get the point that if we want to show more action and more energy and more dynamic movement, we're not going to use a 70 millimeter, we're going to use a wider angle to really take in all that extra light. But if we want to show a dramatic line or a dramatic expression or a dramatic part of our subject and really want our audience to focus in on that, these are the tools that we can use simply through choosing the proper lenses. Because if you really want to narrow down an important moment for the viewer to really soak in your film, you need to show it not like this, but like this. So that's basically the main lenses that you'll use. A lens that you may use once in a while but not very often are macro lenses, and these show incredible detail, depth, and texture very, very close up to create a contrast between wide shots and close-up shots, right? Because contrast is really important, and when it comes to using lenses and choosing lenses, you can't shoot everything wide angle because things will get boring. You need to jump back and forth and give the viewer different things to feel. When you should know by now that when you choose a specific lens, you're showing different energy, you're showing different textures, you're showing a narrow field of view so that they can really focus in on one thing, or you're showing an environment. So it's good to switch back and forth between these things because you're creating that contrast that I'm talking about, and you're creating that flavor. If something is not salted enough, it's too bland, it's too boring, you don't want to try it. If it's too salty, then it's like, ugh, you know, you don't want any more of that at all. But there's a certain balance of contrast between these different elements that you can bring to create better and better films simply by using different lens choices. And last but not least, before we move on to key principles of lighting, is the main differences and when to use prime versus zoom lenses. Now, prime lenses are generally smaller. They have less glass because there's no moving parts. They don't have to work at 70 and 24. They're fixed at 28, 50, 100, whatever their millimeter is the fixed number that they're at. Overall, they have a lower f-stop normally, a lower aperture. So there's 50 millimeter 1.2, 28 millimeter 1.8. Generally, with zoom lenses, they don't really dip below very often, below 2.8. So in turn, prime lenses are generally much more suited for low light situations because the difference between a 1.8 and a 2.8 is double the light that the camera or that the lens is taking into the camera. That's a huge difference when you're shooting in a low light situation. Now, it's better in low light. It has a lower f-stop. The only downside, or one of the downsides, is obviously there's no zooming, so you have to physically move closer to your subject if the shot isn't framed properly. So if you're shooting more on the go, a prime is not as ideal because to physically frame your subject, you have to physically step away or step closer. When you're shooting with a zoom lens, to frame your subject, you simply just zoom in using the lens or zoom out using the lens. So a prime lens is generally used for more controlled situations where you're not going to have to shoot a subject at 200 millimeters and then there's going to be something close to you at more of a 30 millimeter range. You know that you're shooting a certain scenario or scene or interview where there's not much movement, and you can keep the subject at the proper distance because with the prime lens, yes, it's fixed at one focal length, but it's really good at that one focal length. So with that said, the zoom has a lot more versatility. You can zoom out and zoom in. You could potentially even shoot wide angle of one scene and then zoom in and then shoot the close-up without having to change lenses. So this is much more geared for run and gun type stuff when you don't have a lot of time or it's not a very controlled situation, and maybe more guerrilla style filming, live event coverage, and you're having to shoot things at a distance and you can't necessarily get up as close as you'd like to. The downside of that is you're not going to have as shallow of a depth of field. So overall, prime lenses generally have a little bit more of a filmmaking, real film aesthetic, because they generally have that deeper depth of field and better low light in most situations. But there's a bit of a trade-off there. So in my situations, when I use a prime lens is when I know that I have a subject that I can work one-on-one with. We have some time to shoot. It's not a super rushed situation where you have to hop out, get your shots, and then leave. There's more time to collaborate, work with each other, where I can move, get my shots, get physically closer, move away, shoot wide shots, and really capture that more deeper depth of field or shallower depth of field. And then in other situations when I'm doing maybe a live event and I'm shooting coverage, definitely using the zoom lens so that I can get the maximum amount of coverage with different focal lengths without switching lenses. It just really boils down to what kind of coverage that you are shooting. So now that you know all the situations to use a wide angle, telephoto, medium lens, prime lens, day or night, anytime, it's time to really, and how that affects the viewer, most importantly, now it's time to get into the effects and principles of lighting your subject, your film, and any environment. All right, key principles to lighting in your film and video. I really like this whole consciously controlling and keeping in mind of how we're affecting the viewer. Let's keep this thing going. So let's get into lighting. To me, lighting is kind of like the soundtrack to your film. It's kind of there in the background showing your viewer how to feel. Obviously, we're seeing a theme here about how we're affecting the viewer, because in order to create a film that someone likes or doesn't like, there's a lot of choices that are going into getting thrown into that pot of all these ingredients. And if we know what we're doing consciously, then we're going to make an incredible final product. So the lighting is the next incredibly crucial and important step. So why is lighting so important? Like I said, it's almost this element that's in the background that people don't really consciously, take in, but it really affects how you feel. Imagine seeing a beautiful sunset. You're there with your girlfriend, maybe you don't have a girlfriend, doesn't matter. It's the ambiance, right? The mood that is set by that lighting. When you look and you see a sunset, there's a certain vibe that's going on there. And what's provoking that vibe is the space that's created through lighting, right? Just like if we look up and then see the full moon, there's a certain quality to that we like, that we want more of. So lighting is one of these kind of subtle ways that we can kind of get in there and trick our audience into feeling certain things about a subject or a scene or our story, right? So initially, a couple of the first points I want to make about lighting is this simple truth, or this simple metaphor about lighting, that what is exposed, what is in the light, is available for the viewer to see. That's both in the physical sense of literally, if it's exposed, they can see it, and literally, if it's unexposed or in darkness, it's unseen, it's mysterious. So knowing that on the physical level, we can kind of take that a little bit deeper, right? I like doing this. We're seeing a little pattern going on, a little bit deeper, to create mystery or to create a part of a scene that we don't quite want to be shown, right? So if something is in the shadows, it's unknown. So you'll notice in films, in very moody or mysterious scenes or villains, right? Half of their face is lit. You can see half of them is exposed, half of them is not exposed. There's something that's unknown because it's in darkness physically, but energetically and metaphorically, and what the audience perceives and what they feel from that scene, they don't go, oh, the villain is half lit, half not lit. They don't think about it in a literal sense. It's just simply the feeling that's cast, that's coming from that scene. So, back to the main part is that what's exposed is there for your viewer to see. What is not exposed is in darkness. So, light is simply also it's energy. The more energy that's coming into the frame is the more energy that the viewer is getting. And there are certain directors that do this. There's tons of light in all their scenes, and there's just this certain amount of energy. And then on the opposite side, if it's dark and dreary and maybe it's an overcast day, there's kind of that slow, sluggish feeling, right? But if you put energy or light into it, you're putting that same energy and light into the viewer because they're absorbing everything that they're seeing. So with that said, let's get into all the different types of lighting and how we can effectively use those lighting types to affect our audience. So the two different types of lighting that we can use in any video or film are natural lighting, that big, beautiful, bright sun, which is honestly the most kind of difficult at times to use because it's changing throughout the day. The weather and the direction are all different variables that you have to understand a little bit to manage it and make the aesthetic of the video look professional, which we will talk about. And then the second type is artificial, which is what we're using here. So obviously the pros of artificial light is it's a much more controlled situation. I can film for as long as I need to here without the lighting source changing. So the artificial lighting techniques that we're going to go over and master are having a high key setup, a low key setup, 2-point lighting, 3-point lighting, and an onboard setup. When to use those things and how to use those setups properly. First thing is to get on the same page with you guys about the lighting terms. This light that's on the right of my face that's casting the most light on me, the subject, is the key light, right? You can see the shadow right here that's getting filled in by the fill light, right? If we didn't have a fill light, it would be too contrasty. And for a interview, you don't necessarily want to have too much contrast on the person's face because you don't want it to be too dark and mysterious unless that's the kind of interview that you're doing. The third light is the rim light. This is separating me from the background, which creates just that little extra pop. You know, it really makes the subject stand out. So key light hitting the the face of the subject, brightening their face. Fill light filling in those shadows so it's not too contrasty, but the fill light is probably at half of the power as the key, so it is filling in this side of the face, but it's not completely even because it would be boring. And then boom, rim light separating the subject from the background. Now that you're an expert with lighting terms, let's talk about the two main types of lighting: high key lighting and low key lighting. So this is so this is high key lighting, right? I feel like a beauty blogger or some YouTuber that does makeup tutorials. This is a lighting setup where there's an even key light and an even fill light, right? There are no shadows on my face. So what it does is it kind of, masks up imperfections on the face because there's no shadows. There's no contrast to see, detail in the face. So it really cuts out that contrast that we saw before and just creates an even key, an even lighting setup on the face. So this can be used, in certain situations where if you want to give your character, or if you are a YouTuber and you want to have this look, it can be a powerful look. It has definitely a kind of a lightness to it, but it's not necessarily cinematic because there's not enough contrast. So now let's take a look at low key lighting. You can see it's an incredibly different aesthetic and a different look. We went from a more makeup tutorial high key lighting setup where we had two lights and we simply cut out the fill light, and now I have no fill or no bounce or any kind of light that's coming in on this side. So you have this much more contrasty, little mysterious cinematic feeling with just one big key light. So it's amazing how much you can change of the overall mood and emotion that's affecting the viewer by simply changing one light. Now the next part is the size and the distance that the light is from the subject also has a difference in the quality of lighting that's happening. Right now, this is about a 2 foot by 2 foot light that's about arm's length distance away from me. And I have pretty hard shadows on my face. The line, the cut of how the contrast between the lightness and the darkness is very strong. Okay, even though it's a softbox, I'm very close to the light. So the closer I get to the light, the harder the shadows become. The bigger the light becomes, the softer the shadows become. Also, the further that I step away from the light, the softer the shadows become, because the bigger the light is and the more distance that is in between the subject and the light, the more room for the light to wrap around the rest of the subject's face and create much softer shadows. So it's an excellent thing to keep in mind that it's not only where the positioning of the light is, but it's also the size of the light source. Is it a small bulb light? Is it a large softbox? And the distance that the light is from its subject has a drastic effect on the quality of light and shadowing on the subject's face. Pop quiz. Here's a really tricky one. All right, the sun, the biggest, hugest ball of light that we have, right? Bigger than any softbox ever invented. Should this light cast a hard shadow or soft shadow? Think about this. Your first thought might be that it's such a huge softbox type light, so far away that it allows for the light to kind of wrap around like this same similar effect, evening the lighting and shadow contrast out. But no, it's so incredibly far away that it's such a tiny dot in the sky. It's like having a very direct light bulb casting a very harsh shadow. So it's kind of a weird, tricky situation there that sunlight, unless being diffused by clouds, weathering, and time of day, is an incredibly harsh light that we'll get into on how to harness the power of that. All right, this is good stuff, right? So I have my 2-point lighting setup right here. I have my key light about arm's length distance away from me, and I have my fill light filling in some of this shadow area on my face so we're not too contrasty like we just were. We're not a beauty blogger on YouTube, and we're not contrasty cinematic villain smoking a cigar. So this is like kind of a middle ground area. So let's see what happens when we add a rim light. It has that pop, right? You can see that it separates me clearly from the background. And that's really what creates more of that cinematic vibe and that feel, is using your focus and your exposure and your lighting to really separate the subject and really create a more dynamic image and a more dynamic shot. So the hair light is kind of in some ways the most important lighting that you can use out of all three of the 3-point lighting system. The hair light is kind of something that you need more than any of the other lights. You can kind of expose for the face if you don't really have a key or fill, and then if you can just boom, get this little pop hair or rim light on the subject, it's going to create a lot of depth and a lot of separation in a good way for the viewer and for the subject. So let's see now what it looks like with just the hair light. So you can see that the key or the rim light on its own has an interesting look, but it's not necessarily like a go-to look. Maybe if it's someone's ancestor visiting them, or it's a dream, or a memory that someone's going into in a video, then it would make sense to kind of have this glowy rim light. But otherwise, to pull off the rim light, you need some kind of natural source or maybe one key in the front to properly light the front of your subject. So now let's check out the last lighting setup, which is an onboard lighting system, which is mainly for live event coverage, on the go stuff, or guerrilla style shooting. So an onboard light setup, right? More impromptu, on the go, live event coverage style. It's not necessarily the most flattering because there's no angle of the lights. Generally with the key and with the fill, you're at a 45-degree angle, so you're creating that ever important perfect amount of contrast that we're looking for. With the onboard light, it's at a 0-degree angle from the subject. Now the lighting would be better if the onboard light was here and the camera was here, but it's an onboard light, so it's at the same exact angle that the lens and the camera are at to the subject. So what you can do though with this onboard light, in not necessarily as harsh of conditions as this artificial lighting setup, is using the onboard light as a fill light in natural light settings. Because like we talked about, the sun can generally cast very harsh shadows, very non-beauty, non-flattering lighting conditions. So what you can do is use your onboard light setup to counteract and boost up and balance out those hard shadows in the subject's face in natural lighting conditions, which leads me to using natural lighting.